Facebook and Twitter, Instagram and Snapchat, the list goes on and on. Without question, social media is impacting the world and the church in significant ways. Today, we'll just begin to intersect these trends with the world of missions and discuss some of the positive potential as well as some of the possible pitfalls. Our topic today, social media and missions, a starter discussion.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a podcast for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also leave us a message and engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. Here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi everyone, my name is Mags and I'm your host as we continue to discover how to participate in global missions more effectively. Just before we get into our interview about social media with Scott Moreau, I want to extend a big thank you for being a listener to this podcast. As we recorded this episode, which is the last for season number 1, our technical producer Steve let us know that we have surpassed 10,000 downloads for this first season. We are encouraged as a team, and we want to say thank you for sharing in this with us. Over the summer, we will replay some of our most popular episodes, and then on September 6th, we look forward to launching season number 2. By the way, we would love to consider your feedback in our planning. Is there something about this podcast that you've really appreciated? Is there something that drove you crazy? Is there a topic, perhaps, that might be especially helpful? We would love to hear from you as we plan and prepare for season number 2. You can send us an email from the website or message us on Facebook or Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. Our desire is to serve you well, and thanks again for listening. Just before we get to today's interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Are you looking to mobilize your church for global missions? Start by taking the Perspectives course. This course will give you a better understanding of the historical, biblical, cultural, and strategic foundations of missions. Visit perspectivescourse.org today to find a course near you. And now, here's our interview with today's expert guest.
Well, hi again, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to today's expert interview. Our guest is Dr. Scott Moreau. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet Scott, he lives in the Chicago area now, and he is the Associate Academic Dean of Wheaton College's Graduate School and a professor of Intercultural Studies. He spent 14 years on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as Cru in the U.S. and Power to Change in Canada, and 10 of those years were spent in Africa. He is the author of several books on missions, including one of my favorites, an introductory textbook, now in its second edition, called Introducing World Missions, and he has also written on cross-cultural communication, contextualization, and spiritual warfare. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Just before we get into today's topic, dealing with social media, would you share just a little bit with us about yourself and how you came to be passionate about God's mission?
Yeah, I can talk about how that happened in 2 phases. First, I had a very strong sense of call into ministry. Actually, the best way to describe it was I had a vision when I was a sophomore in college. And following that up, I transferred to Wheaton College. And when I came to Wheaton, they gave me an aptitude test. It describes, it's looking at your personality and what career path might fit you best. And so when I got the responses back from the test, they gave you 50 career options, and you really don't want to do something below 30. And number 50 on that list was a pastor. And number 1 on that list was a computer programmer. And I thought, Lord, you've called me into ministry. What in the world does this mean? I took it to mean that becoming a pastor was not the best choice for me. And I followed that path since that time. And from my vantage point, it certainly ended up being a very good choice in the direction my life has taken since then. So the door was kind of open, and then through a series of divine coincidences, my senior year at Wheaton, all kinds of calls were being made from chapel and other places to go to Nigeria and teach science. And I was a science major in my undergrad. And so that started me on that path. And then phase two, and this is going to be a lot shorter answer. Phase two, when I was in seminary, every time I looked at courses and electives to take, the only ones that were interesting to me were missions courses.
Hmm.
So first getting me to become a missionary was that first phase, and the second phase was getting me to study missions. The topic in its technical word is called missiology, and that's just the study of missions. And that came in seminary, and then that's what I've been teaching ever since that time.
Sure. And how long have you been teaching at Wheaton now?
I just finished 25 years at Wheaton after 7 years in Africa. So this is my 33rd year of teaching, and it really makes me feel older than I know I am.
Wow. Well, thank you for your faithfulness in that. Such an important role, and how many students have been challenged and equipped. Way to go.
Thanks. Thanks.
Well, our topic today is social media. And you mentioned your interest in computers there. And in some of our discussions, yours and mine previous, we've talked about statistics and trends. So we come to this technology today. Start us off by just describing, how do you see social media impacting the church?
I think the way you have to talk about this is you talk about it at two levels. One is, how is it impacting individual members of the church? And I don't know any of our junior high and high school kids that are not deeply impacted by social media today.
Right.
And our 20 somethings as well too. So on one side, whether or not the church is connected to social media, the people in the church are. And that's going to have an impact, even if the church is not does not have a Facebook page, does not have a LinkedIn profile, is not involved in Twitter. Churches don't have to do that to be impacted by social media, because the members of the churches are all impacted by social media.
Right. Yeah, and probably that extends to most, as you said, young people, but really across the generations now.
Yeah, and I watch my kids, and they're kind of my touchstone for thinking through how it's impacting. And I see them, and you know what? We don't email each other very much. It's usually messaging through our phones. It would be Instagramming pictures that, I just came back from 2.5 weeks in Europe and sent several pictures out, and it's a way to connect with them. We send pictures, we send videos to each other. My kids are not on Twitter, so I don't see them as much there.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that's how I connect with my kids, and I know that I'm just on the tip of the iceberg for the way they connect with their friends.
Right. Well, maybe emerging from this, you begin to have some ideas about how the church could use social media effectively.
Well, I'd say if the pastor is not engaged in social media, he or she needs to be. And that's a simple reality. And it's not as much wasting your time for hours on end, but I usually have a discipline of maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour in the morning, browsing through various social media that I belong to. Not because I feel I have to catch up with all my friends, but a lot of it is I'm connecting with the world of missions. A lot of mission agencies are on Twitter. There fewer are on Instagram. Many are on social media known as LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, if you follow the feeds on all of those, you can suddenly be aware of what's going on with World Vision. You can see what's going on with persecution.org. You can find out what Desiring God is saying that day. And I think if churches are aware of this, and I'd say the pastoral staff in particular, they can be kept up to date more. But even when I think I'm a member of a missions committee at my local church, and the extent to which our committee is or is not on social media is impacting how much they know about what's going on in the world of missions today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you say there's any one channel, social media channel, which is used more often than others? If, in other words, if a missions committee were to say, well, we've got capacity to take in one channel of social media, would you have one to recommend outright?
I would probably recommend Facebook. It's
Sure.
interesting. I got off of Facebook myself because I got unexpectedly some very inappropriate invitations. And I realized in some way I was connected through someone that was friends with. Suddenly I was getting these things. So I'm off of Facebook now, but that's still what I hear about the most. But I also hear that Facebook hits my generation more.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, my kids, I'm thinking none of my kids is on Facebook.
Right.
They're on Snapchat.
And
They're
Instagram.
on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are on Twitter. I mentioned not of my kids, but some of their friends are.
Mm-hmm.
And so Facebook, I mean, maybe the way to answer that really is you got to answer it by generation. So my age, I just turned 61, Facebook. But my kids' age, Instagram or Snapchat would be the types of things they would be using far more often.
Sure. Well, as we think about global missions and the missions committee again, what are some of the ways that you see that social media could be used to promote awareness and participation in global missions?
I use it on a regular basis myself because a lot of agencies are using it. Now I'm talking about Twitter more than anything else. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a friend of one of my daughters who convinced her dad that he needed to have a Twitter account. And my first thought was, why do I need a Twitter account? Do I need to tell people I'm brushing my teeth right now?
Mm-hmm.
And some people use Twitter in that way. But the reality is, she said, no, Dad, this is where I get all my news, because any organization worth its salt has a Twitter account and you can connect to them and follow them.
Right.
And I found there are literally hundreds of mission agencies that have Twitter accounts. And if you follow them, you get to see the types of things that they're talking about. Now, for the most part, they're promoting themselves, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is one approach, a strategy. But I think the better strategies are for agencies to have someone who's looking at other feeds, and it's not as much pure self-promotion as it is promotion of the world of missions and what's taking place.
Right.
From natural disasters to human-made disasters. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are going on around the world, and social media makes those accessible far more quickly than just about anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to stop there because I could go on forever, but that's a teacher speaking. And
Right,
that's
right.
not necessarily helpful for what you're looking for right now.
Well, I think the idea that it is a source of up-to-date information.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be selective as well. That's why I ask for your recommendation, because even social media feeds, there are so many of them. We don't have capacity to keep up with everything. We need to have filters, or we
Right.
have limited capacity, right?
Right, we do. And so, for example, I use something called Flipboard. It's an
Mm-hmm.
app on the iPhone or the iPad. It's also an app available on Android platforms. Flipboard lets you take your Twitter feeds and choose which ones you want to have show up. And it literally turns it into a magazine. And so every time somebody tweets, it's a little article. And if they're linking to a bigger article, then you tap on it and it takes you to the bigger article. So in the space of 15 minutes, I can look over easily several hundred Twitter feeds and decide I want to follow this one, I don't. I've also tended to clump them together. So I have a feed for missional church type of things. I have a
Mm-hmm.
feed for traditional mission organizations types of things. And that, when I sort them that way behind the scenes, I don't sort them manually. I
Right.
had to set them up that way to begin with, but now when I go through Flipboard, I can go to the social media feeds and I can look, okay, I want to see what's going on in the world of missional thinking today, or I want to see what traditional agencies are talking about today.
Right. Right. Well, helpful to have that recommendation too. I use Flipboard, but not for Twitter. I use it for news.
Right.
And you've mentioned a great application there. I would also just mention for those listening, I use Hootsuite for a very similar function where I have columns. It does need to be set up, and it's not as pretty as Flipboard, I would add, but it's very efficient because I can say, I want to see news, and it rolls through. Or I want to see classical mission agencies, and it rolls through, and it's sorted in that way, and very efficient. Well, as we turn our thinking toward our workers who are in various places around the world, what are some ideas that you have as far as how they could use social media to engage with their supporters in their sending churches and sending cultures?
Yeah, I see some big pluses and some big minuses. The pluses, of course, are they can let people know what's going on typically we're used to people sending out a prayer letter,
Hmm.
and Facebook is something that attracts the older generation. That's where perhaps the majority of the donors are. But if they want to connect to the next generation, they've got to do a different form of social media. They don't have to, but doing a different form of social media will make a difference for them.
Hmm.
And I'd say you can certainly talk about what you're doing. The plus is that then all of your supporters can know what's going on in your life, and you can solicit prayer. You can let them know of opportunities. You can update them on what's going on in your part of the world. The downside of this is a lot of people engaged in missions these days are engaged in ways that they don't want to advertise that they're missionaries.
Right.
And so the more social media involvement, I mean, it's absolutely true. Nothing is private on social media.
Hmm.
And you just have to take that as your orientation towards it. So whatever you say has to be something that you're willing for everyone to see, including local government officials, including local church representatives. So missionaries need caution, but I think perhaps it might scare people out of doing anything, and that might be a mistake as well too.
Great. Well, this is an area where I wonder if we can't maybe be helpful too in defining, businesses have social media policies,
Yes,
um,
yeah.
helping some of our uh, newer generation folks, well, maybe not so new in some cases, but how they use it to have some wise guidelines developed that would be helpful, and they would need to be tailored, of course, to whatever context they were serving in.
Well, one guideline would be anything you put up on social media is going to be findable.
Hmm.
And I know a lot of younger generation that have put things up that they're just deeply embarrassed over right now. But the web, in effect, doesn't forget,
Right,
and
right.
and that can be a potential challenge for people. If you have a informal set of guidelines, is keep in mind whatever you say is going to be findable, and it's going to be there potentially permanently.
Right. If
So,
you start with that as the baseline and work from there.
right. And a second suggestion might be beware of flame wars,
Hmm.
where people
Mm.
get into major battles. And I've got some friends who like to do this. I think it's part of their personality, but it really does not show well when people think they have to defend things online, that they don't really have to defend them for the sake of the gospel. Sometimes it's just people like to get into battles online, and they're a little bit less restrained online than they are in person, or perhaps even far less restrained. All that means is you got to be careful before you engage in any type of flame war online, because again, there's a permanent record of that that's kept
Right.
somewhere.
Well, there's some of the pros and the cons there, and I suppose some of them apply for the churches who are trying to be supportive of workers. Same types of concerns you would recommend, mention to them.
Yeah, same type of concerns, and I know churches are getting savvier and savvier, and that's good to see. But you still see occasional well-intentioned churches putting up on their website the names of missionaries they support and the countries they serve in, when that presents the possibility of a security risk for those missionaries.
Mhm.
So I'd say, while I strongly encourage mission committees and members of missions committees and pastoral staff to be engaged in social media, the cautions for the church are, if you're engaged and you're connected, if you have a feed on your church's site which is following your missionaries, you better make sure they know that you're doing that, and do
Mhm.
it with their permission, just because we don't want to unintentionally expose them to the possibility of maybe being embarrassed, maybe being kicked out of the country. A former alumna of ours just got kicked out of a Middle East country
Mm.
because the officials got to know too much about him. And even though he was being extremely cautious, he was given 24-hour notice, and he's gone now, and he's wrestling with what does this mean for us now?
Mm.
We can't follow God's call to this country anymore. It was not a church that put him out online, so
Mhm.
this was not anybody's fault as far as I know.
Mhm.
But the reality is that's a caution for churches as well too.
Yeah. Well, in going past there, you mentioned for those that it's appropriate for, it's possible for churches to link up feeds, for example, Facebook or
Right,
Twitter or some of these other social media channels right onto their websites.
right, right. And they could do feeds for organizations with whom they have missionaries, or they could do, if the missionaries have feeds, they could do it themselves. But I still say, while that's a viable source of information, you never do that without letting the missionaries know you want to do that and see what they say.
Mhm. That's good. Very good ideas here, practical. I'll just mention for our listeners that we do take show notes while these interviews are ongoing. So if there's something you've heard, either by way of mention of an app or an idea here, we capture all of that and you can find it in the show notes on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. Scott, it's been said that social media has turned Western society more into a fame and shame based community. I wonder if you'd unpack that a little bit, fame and shame, and then just discuss what impact this might have on the church.
The reality is these days, you can be a superstar or a super idiot in social media in the space of 24 hours.
That's
You know,
good.
for something to go viral, it just doesn't take long at all.
Hmm.
And for something to go virally good and virally bad takes the same amount of time. And so on one side, uh, how many Twitter followers do I have? It's a game that people have played on Facebook, they play it on LinkedIn, and usually the secular media says that, if you're under 10,000 followers, then you really don't have much of a voice. And unfortunately, the way people tend to get followed is if there's something negative going on more than something positive. I mean, we've seen this recently at Wheaton when we got into a kerfluffle that wound up being a social media war of proponents and opponents, and most of it was a type of publicity that the college preferred not to have going on around it. And we wound up in the social media universe on the shame side of things rather than the
Mm,
fame side of things.
mm,
And just think of the current U.S. election and how both major candidates have used this, and certainly their attempt to shame the other candidate and bring fame to themselves in the process. And one of the ways they've each done this, it's not surprising to find out of all the candidates in the field, the two that are now appear to have the nomination, Clinton and Trump, have the largest number of bogus Twitter followers.
mm,
They set up fake accounts and follow them as a means of creating fame.
mm.
And then these fake accounts are also casting shame and aspersion on the other candidate. And so we're seeing a type of social media war. Now, I don't think churches should be ready to move in that direction. That
Mhm.
would be inappropriate. However, stepping into social media as an organization is something that needs to be done, but needs to be done carefully.
So I'm hearing you say, yes, there's some risk involved, but it's a risk
Yeah.
that we need to wisely engage.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Mm,
and and again, we talked about guidelines for individuals, and maybe guidelines for churches
mm,
would be the same type of thing. And we mentioned a couple like not having a feed of your missionaries without the missionaries knowing that you're having that feed, uh, but having a feed on your webpage. One of the realities is social media keeps all the content on your webpage fresh. However, you don't always control it.
right.
And so that's a challenge that's possibly there as well too. What feeds are you following, and in what ways might they add fame and or shame
Hmm.
to your church is a good question to be asking yourself.
A double-edged sword.
Very much so. And you
Hmm.
think of the 15 minutes of fame that people get and how they use that. I mean, from the Justin Bieber phenomena to you can think of hundreds of negative stories of people that have done wrong. These are all the types of things that social media is particularly poised to either create or to destroy. And so this is one of the things that is changing our framework of culture. And you think of even simple things, simple but harsh things like cyberbullying.
Hmm.
Uh, the reality is we face this, and it's used from the elementary school level on up to the national campaign level, at least here in the United States. And it shows you how much this is permeated in our culture. So back to that question, how are you seeing social media impacting the church? It's hitting individuals in the church, and if the church is ignoring that, it's missing a big component of what's going on in the lives of its own people.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a fast-changing world, but we're going to ask about resources. Are there any resources, web articles, books, or websites that you would recommend to a church or to a missions committee looking to grow in their engagement of social media?
I don't know of any books off the top of my head, and the problem with the book is by the time it gets published, it's already been in the hopper well over a year. That's just the reality of publishing. Mm-hmm. And so finding a book that's engaging social media, you're always going to be behind the time. And so for me, doing some simple Google searches, and I would say places like Christianity Today online, go to trusted media resources to find articles. Pew Research has a lot of information available on demographics and so on, and they're another good source to find information in relation to mm-hmm. religions, faith, and so on. And then you'll find some people that you want to follow. An Ed Stetzer, for example, mm-hmm. John Piper, for example, Timothy Keller. Now, granted, I'm naming Americans, and I don't know Canadian names, but finding people that you know and trust is also an important place to find resources in relation to social media.
Mm-hmm. Good advice for us, Scott. If our audience would like to follow Scott Moreau and learn more about what you're doing, how you're doing it, and observing, learning from you, how can they find and follow you, Scott?
Probably the best way to do it is follow my Twitter feed. Now, this turns into a shameless set of promotion, but it's Scott Moreau 1 at Twitter. And you'll find, if you look at the tweets I've done, that I do demographic things. I do occasionally I'll do things like an article on chocolate that I really loved, on how chocolate increases your intelligence, and clearly that's true to me. So wow. I had to make sure that I fed my few hundred followers on that. So that at least gives you an idea of the types of things that are. I don't post about brushing my teeth. I don't post on Twitter about where I'm going or where I'm speaking. What I do post about is feeds or articles that I found interesting, that I thought would be interesting to people who follow missions in the world of missions.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's true. Thanks for not posting about your teeth, by the way. But
right.
Scott does have a very broad range of interests related to global missions. Very, very well read, an editor of books and author himself, and so lots of great content that comes from Wheaton and from Dr. Moreau. Scott, I want to say thank you for spending the time with us today and sharing with our audience some of these ideas. We really appreciate your being with us.
Glad to be with you.
We hope you found today's interview to be both informative and inspiring. If you missed anything or would like to check out the resources or links mentioned during the interview, you can find the show notes we've prepared at our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. You can also use the website or our Facebook page to suggest a particular topic or expert you'd like to hear featured on this program. The Global Missions Podcast is co-sponsored by the Jaffrey Centre for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada. Thanks for listening in. I'm your host, Mags, and I invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.